The world as they knew it had ended. It hadn't been a sudden collapse. Not a single catastrophic event that wiped everything away in an instant. Instead, it was a slow, creeping decay that spread across the country like a sickness. The fossil fuels that had once powered every city, every car, every machine, were gone. They had squeezed the earth dry, ignoring the warnings. Pushing past the point of no return. And when the last reserves ran empty, everything fell apart. Without fuel, trucks stopped running, supply chains broke, and grocery stores emptied within weeks. The government was unable to control the growing panic, had fractured. Some states tried to hold on, but without a central power, chaos took over. Within a few years, the once united United States had splintered into isolated territories, each ruled by whoever was strong enough to take control. The presidency was a thing of the past. Now the country belonged to warlords, self-proclaimed governors, and desperate survivors, trying to carve out a place in a world that no longer had space for the weak. A new way of life. Samira Noor had lived through it all. She had been a scientist. Someone who had worked on renewable energy solutions in a desperate attempt to slow the collapse. But she had been too late. Now, she was just another survivor, wandering through the ruins of what had once been the greatest nation on earth. She walked cautiously through the empty streets of what had once been a thriving city. Skyscrapers, once symbols of progress, now stood as skeletal remains, their windows shattered, their steel frames rusting beneath the relentless grip of time. Vines and weeds grew through cracked pavement, reclaiming the land. The silence was eerie, no hum of traffic, no distant murmur of life. Just the wind, whistling through hollowed-out buildings. Samira adjusted the strap of her backpack, feeling the reassuring weight of her supplies. Water, a few scavenged cans of food, and most importantly, her notes. Inside, she carried the remnants of her old work. Sketches, formulas, and ideas that might help rebuild something, anything, if she could just find the right people to listen. But finding people who cared about rebuilding was rare. Most were too busy surviving. She had seen it time and time again, small settlements popping up in the ruins, trying to recreate a sense of normalcy. Some were ruled by leaders who had taken control with brute force, demanding loyalty in exchange for protection. Others tried to function like the old world, setting up markets, schools, even governments. But without resources, without fuel, everything felt like a desperate attempt to hold onto something that was already gone. The fractured lands. The country was divided now, each region with its own rules. To the north, cold winds and harsh winters made survival nearly impossible. The Midwest had turned into a wasteland of nomadic tribes, moving from town to town, taking what they needed and leaving nothing behind. The West Coast had been one of the first to collapse under its own weight, its major cities turning into battlegrounds between warring factions. Samira had spent most of her time in what had once been the South, where the climate was survivable and the land could still be farmed. But even here, life was dangerous. Raiders patrolled the highways, hunting for supplies. People who had once been neighbors now turned against each other for a sip of clean water. And yet, despite it all, Samira still believed in a future. She had heard whispers of a place, a settlement different from the others. A place where people were trying to build something new, not just to survive, but to thrive. A city without fuel, without the luxuries of the old world, but one where people worked together. A place where knowledge mattered, where her research might finally mean something. She just had to find it. The journey. Her journey took her across broken highways, through forests that had begun reclaiming abandoned suburbs, and past towns that had been left to rot. Each night, she built small fires, careful to keep them hidden, knowing that light was an invitation for trouble. She met people along the way. Some were kind. offering food in exchange for stories of the world beyond their little pockets of safety. Others were desperate. Their eyes hollow, their hands gripping weapons that they barely had the strength to use. And then there were the ones who saw her as an opportunity, raiders, scavengers. Men who believed strength was the only law left. She avoided them when she could, fought when she had to. The knife she carried wasn't just for cutting food. After weeks on the road, she finally reached the outskirts of what had once been Atlanta. The city was barely recognizable, its skyline broken, its streets empty. But somewhere within its ruins, she found it, the settlement she had heard about. A community, hidden behind makeshift walls, powered not by oil or gas, but by the ingenuity of those who refused to give up. They had harnessed wind, water, and even human effort, to create energy. They had farms, schools, and even a rudimentary form of government. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A new beginning. Samira approached cautiously, her heart pounding. This was what she had been searching for. A place where she could use her knowledge, where she could be more than just another survivor. A guard at the entrance raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice weary but not unkind. She took a deep breath. "I'm someone who wants to help." For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The world had ended, but maybe, just maybe, a new one was beginning. The city of survivors. Samira stood at the gates, feeling the weight of her journey settle into her bones. The settlement, hidden within the ruins of Atlanta, was more than she had dared to hope for. Beyond the barricades, she could see people moving about, repairing buildings, tending to small gardens. Children playing in the dirt roads. It was a stark contrast to the world outside, where survival was a day-to-day struggle, and trust was a rare commodity. The guard who had stopped her eyed her carefully. He was tall, with weathered skin and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't the type to take chances. "You say you want to help," he said. "We've heard that before." Samira understood his hesitation. Settlements like this had been raided before, people pretending to seek refuge, only to betray those who took them in. She reached into her backpack slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I have something to offer," she said, pulling out her notebook. "I used to be a scientist. I worked in renewable energy before everything fell apart." The guard's eyes flickered to the pages she held out. After a long moment, he sighed. "You'll have to talk to Eleanor. She decides who stays and who goes." He nodded toward a woman approaching from the settlement entrance. The leader of the New World. Eleanor Steele was a woman in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with gray. She wore a patched-up jacket. Her posture strong, confident. She had the look of someone who had seen too much but refused to break. "You're the scientist," she said, her voice steady. It wasn't a question. Samira nodded. "I was. I still am, I suppose." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then gestured for her to follow. "Come inside. Let's talk." Samira stepped through the gates and into a world she hadn't thought possible. The settlement wasn't just surviving, it was rebuilding. People weren't just scraping by, they were creating something sustainable. There were makeshift wind turbines, water collection systems, and even rudimentary solar panels salvaged from the ruins. Eleanor led her to a small building that looked like it had once been a school. Inside, maps covered the walls, along with hand-drawn schematics for irrigation systems, power grids, and supply routes. "We built this place from nothing," Eleanor said, watching Samira closely. "We've survived raids, disease, and starvation. But if we want to do more than survive, we need ideas. We need knowledge." She crossed her arms. "What can you offer us?" Samira placed her notebook on the table. "Everything I know about renewable energy. Wind, water, even biofuel. Ways to make power without relying on what we've lost. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, flipping through the pages. Then, finally, she nodded. You can stay. But you'll have to prove yourself.